The radio was still roaring inside a silver pickup left on the shoulder of US 72 while the July heat pressed down on Florence, Alabama. In that noise and in that stillness, two young names would echo for more than a decade. Jessica Monroe, 18 years old, Daniel Whitaker, 20 years old. At 12:30 in the morning, a final message from Jessica's phone reached out like a flare in the night. "Someone is following us." A witness would later speak of an old red Bronco drifting behind them. Then that Bronco slipped away from every official record, as if it had never existed. Years later, the Tennessee River surrendered a soaked handbag. A rusted metal box surfaced under an oak. A Polaroid photo appeared from the shadows of a concert crowd. Each fragment pulled Florence deeper into a story of fear, silence, and relentless pursuit of the truth. Who drove the red Bronco that the town tried to erase? Why did a night of music and laughter end with silence and shallow earth? If you want to uncover these answers with us, then like this video, subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and turn on the bell icon so you do not miss the next episodes. Tell us in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and help us reach 5,000 likes so we can continue this journey together. The heat of that July night still lingers in the memory of Florence. The Tennessee River carried the sound of festival drums while headlights traced across O'Neill Bridge. The Silverado stood abandoned with the radio turned high enough to shake the windows. On the passenger seat, a faint smear of blood marked the fabric. On the floor lay a single woman's shoe with its lace pulled loose. A folded map with a red circle around O'Neill Bridge waited on the dashboard, as if pointing to a place chosen in advance. The driver's window bore a cracked spider line catching every passing reflection. Dust drifted across the tire tracks, fading in the darkness. That night on US 72 marked the beginning of Florence's long shadow. Families would search the riverbanks. A community would hold candlelight vigils year after year, and evidence thought lost would return to the surface, one piece at a time. This is where it all began, with a silver truck, a lost message, and a silence that lasted 13 years. The streets of Florence were alive on July 14, 2007. The Tennessee River Music Festival filled the summer air with pounding drums and bright lights dancing over the riverfront. Crowds swayed to the music while vendors sold cold drinks that could barely fight off the heavy Alabama heat. Laughter and voices rose into the night sky as families and friends gathered to soak in every moment of the festival. It was one of those nights when the town felt vibrant and unbreakable. Amid the lights and the noise, Jessica Monroe moved with her Polaroid camera slung around her neck and her familiar green canvas backpack resting on her shoulders. She had just finished high school, her eyes full of youthful excitement, capturing images of her friends and the glowing stage. Every snap of the camera was her way of keeping the memory alive, her smile reflecting the joy of a girl who believed the future was waiting for her. By her side was Daniel Whitaker, a sophomore who carried himself with a quiet gentleness. He stood with a careful pride in his silver Chevrolet Silverado, polished and shining under the festival lights. That truck was more than a vehicle to him. It was freedom, responsibility, and the symbol of nights like this when he could take Jessica anywhere she wished to go. He kept a close eye on her through the crowd, protective yet calm. A steady presence in the chaos of music and movement. At 11:45 that night, as the final acts wrapped up and the crowd began to scatter, Jessica and Daniel decided to head home. A few of their friends caught Daniel's eye, and he paused for a moment to wave, a small gesture that would become etched in memory. That simple wave was the last time anyone saw them alive in the glow of festival lights. Their Silverado rolled away from the parking lot and disappeared into the night road that stretched toward US 7. The celebration was ending for Florence. But for Jessica and Daniel, the night was only beginning, and the silence of the highway would soon replace the music of the river. What they did not know was that eyes were already watching and following, waiting to strike when the roads turned empty. The Silverado that Daniel cherished was not supposed to end its night on the shoulder of US 72. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Drivers passing through the dark stretch of highway slowed down at the sight of a truck sitting abandoned with its headlights dim and its radio still blaring wild rock music into the empty night. The heat of the July air pressed heavy, yet a chill ran through anyone who stepped close enough to peer inside. The driver's side window was cracked with a faint spider line running outward as if something had struck it with force. On the passenger seat rested a faint smear of blood, too small to explain much but too clear to ignore. The floorboard told its own story. A single woman's shoe with its lace pulled loose lay tipped over as though it had been dropped in panic, and on the dashboard sat a folded paper map, creased from use, with a single red circle drawn around O'Neill Bridge. That circle, silent and unexplained, felt like a mark of intention. What unsettled the families the most was not only what was found inside the truck, but what left no trace at all. At 12:30, half an hour before the Silverado was discovered, Jessica's phone had managed to send out a final desperate message to her best friend. "Someone is following us." The words froze the blood of everyone who read them. Yet when investigators tried to trace the signal, the coordinates were wrong, pointing nearly 10 miles away in the wrong forest, sending search teams chasing shadows while the real trail went cold. The Silverado sat like a monument of confusion, with its loud music echoing through the night air while its owners were nowhere to be found. Families, friends, and strangers alike knew instantly that this was not a runaway joyride or a prank. Something violent and unexplainable had happened on that highway, and as dawn approached, the weight of those clues began pressing down on Florence, leaving only one haunting thought. If the truck was here, abandoned with its story written in fragments, where were Jessica and Daniel? When the Silverado was found empty on US 72, fear spread quickly through two households in Florence. Jessica's family called the police almost as soon as they realized she had not come home. Daniel's parents did the same when his phone went unanswered through the night. To both families, the abandoned truck was not a puzzle. It was a warning. Something terrible had happened. But when they rushed to the station with voices trembling and eyes full of panic, the response they received was cold and dismissive. Officers leaned back in their chairs and suggested that the young couple might have stayed out late with friends or gone off to another party after the festival. They promised that Jessica and Daniel would likely return by morning. Their words carried no urgency, no weight of alarm, as if the blood smear, the cracked window, and the shoe in the truck meant nothing at all. Daniel's father could not accept it. He stormed into the station, slammed his hand down on the wooden desk, and demanded answers. His voice thundered through the small room. He told them that his son would never disappear without telling him. He knew something was wrong. Jessica's mother sat quietly in the corner of the same room, her hands wrapped tightly around a photo of her daughter in her graduation dress. Her tears ran silently as she begged the officers to believe her. Every second that passed felt like her daughter's life slipping away. But her trembling voice was met with an indifferent headshake. The night dragged on, each hour stretching, heavier than the last. Outside the station windows, Florence sank into thick darkness. Inside, two families pleaded while the police showed little more than routine patience. The waiting became unbearable, the fear impossible to silence. And when the sun finally rose on July 15th, Florence was shaken awake by the truth that Jessica Monroe and Daniel Whitaker had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a truck full of clues and a silence that no explanation could comfort. The families were certain of one thing: if the police refused to act, the community itself would have to rise and search for the missing dot. By the morning of July 15th, the silence had shattered. News of the abandoned Silverado spread quickly, and Florence gathered with urgency. More than 300 people arrived at the riverbanks, a mix of police officers, volunteers, neighbors, and even strangers who could not ignore the fear gripping the town. Pickup trucks lined the parking lot near O'Neill Bridge. Small boats belonging to fishermen floated on the river waiting for instructions. Canine units were brought in to search the dense pine woods that bordered the highway. The dogs pulled strongly at their leashes, sniffing the ground and barking with determination. For a short distance they held the trail of Jessica and Daniel. Then, as the handlers pushed closer to the river's edge, the scent stopped suddenly. It was as if the trail had been cut off all at once. One handler lowered his voice and admitted what many already feared. The young couple may have been taken onto a boat or into another vehicle. The thought left the searchers staring out across the calm surface of the Tennessee River, their hearts heavy with dread. As the heat of the Alabama sun grew harsher, divers plunged into the murky brown water. Each time they surfaced, a crowd of family and volunteers waited in breathless silence, praying for something that could explain what had happened. Near noon, one diver rose holding a faded green canvas bag, water dripping steadily from its seams. It was Jessica's handbag, the one she carried with her to the festival. The crowd fell into absolute silence. When the bag was opened, the contents deepened the grief. There was no wallet and no phone. Instead, there was a waterlogged notebook, with its ink smeared but still showing faint song lyrics and small notes. Jessica had written in her own hand. To her family, this was proof that she had not left willingly. Someone had taken her belongings and thrown them into the river to erase evidence. Jessica's mother held the notebook against her chest, her tears unstoppable as she repeated that her daughter would never abandon those words. The search carried on through the day, sweat-soaked shirts and exhausted faces moving through the woods and along the water. Yet every hour that passed without finding Jessica or Daniel weighed heavier on the town. And as the sun began to set over the river, Florence was left with a haunting certainty. If a handbag could be thrown away so carelessly, what had happened? To the witness who claimed to see a red Bronco tailing the Silverado as the volunteers packed up their boats and the divers laid down their gear, a man stepped into the Florence police station with a detail that lit a small spark of hope. He was a middle-aged driver who had been on US 72 the very night Jessica and Daniel vanished. His voice was steady at first as he told officers that he had seen an old red Ford Bronco following close behind the silver Silverado he remembered. The glow of its taillights in the dark, and the way it seemed to shadow every turn of Daniel's truck, the man went further. He said he believed he had caught part of the license plate and promised to write it down. For the families waiting in agony, this was the lead they had been begging for. A license plate could name an owner. It could open the door to real answers. But when officers tried to contact him the next day, something had changed. The confident witness was now uncertain. He shook his head and said maybe he had been mistaken. Maybe it was not a Bronco at all. Maybe it was another kind of SUV. The promise of a plate number was gone, replaced by hesitation and silence. The families felt a wave of disbelief. How could someone describe a vehicle so clearly one day and erase it from memory the next? Whispers moved quietly through Florence. Some believed the man had been pressured into silence. Others thought fear had closed his mouth. The truth was never written down, and the only clear description of the red Bronco faded from the official reports as if it had never existed. For Amanda Monroe and the Whitaker family, the sudden retreat of this witness was more frightening than the silence of the river. It was as if an invisible hand was brushing away every clue that could lead them to Jessica and Daniel. And with the Bronco thread erased, investigators turned their eyes toward an easier story, one that placed suspicion close to home. With the red Bronco lead slipping into silence, investigators turned toward a simpler explanation. They claimed that jealousy could have been the spark behind Jessica and Daniel's disappearance. On July 17th, police arrived at the home of Ethan Cole, Jessica's former boyfriend. He was 20 years old, still living in Florence, and had once been close to her before their breakup. Neighbors watched in shock as Ethan was led away, his face pale and confused. Insisting he had done nothing wrong, in the parking lot sat his blue sedan. Officers inspected every inch of it and quickly noticed long scratches running down one side as if the car had collided with something. Local newspapers rushed to print photos of Ethan being escorted into custody. Bold headlines declared him a prime suspect. For a moment, many in Florence believed the mystery was solved, but the evidence told a different story. Forensic teams compared the paint from Ethan's car with the traces left on the cracked window of Daniel's Silverado. The samples did not match. DNA testing from the small blood smear inside the Silverado also ruled Ethan out completely. Ethan maintained through hours of questioning that he had been home that night playing video games with friends. Those friends later confirmed his alibi in detail by July 19th. Only 2 days after his arrest, Ethan was released with no charges. Reporters crowded outside the station, capturing his exhausted expression as he walked away. Some residents began to doubt the investigation altogether. The Monroe and Whitaker families were furious. They had begged officers not to ignore the Bronco or the map circled with O'Neill Bridge. Yet the police had spent their time chasing an easy story about a jealous ex-boyfriend. Trust in the investigation began to crack. Families felt that precious hours had been wasted while the real trail was growing colder. The frustration burned quietly through Florence, leaving the question that no one wanted to ask aloud. If it was not Ethan, then who was truly behind the Silverado left abandoned on ES72. As the months passed without progress, Florence watched the case unravel into scattered whispers and fading headlines. From 2008 onward, tips trickled in from across the region. Someone reported seeing a girl who looked like Jessica in Nashville. Another caller swore that a man resembling Daniel had been spotted at a Birmingham gas station. Each tip lit a small flame of hope for the families. Search teams traveled, interviews were conducted, and hours were spent chasing these fragments. But every single lead ended in disappointment. They were all mistakes. Each false sighting drained the families further, replacing hope with exhaustion. Then, in 2009, a group of hunters stumbled across something chilling in the northern Florence woods. Half buried in dirt and grass was a gray hoodie, stained dark across one sleeve. The stains looked like old blood. When news reached the families, they clung to the possibility that this could finally be the piece of evidence, linking back to that July night. For weeks, they waited anxiously for the forensic results. But instead of answers, they were met with silence. The hoodie had vanished from the evidence locker. An internal note claimed it was lost due to administrative error. Few believed that explanation. Amanda Monroe, Jessica's sister, voiced what many were already thinking. A blood-stained hoodie does not just disappear. Someone was hiding something. By 2010, the official statement came down. There were no concrete leads left to pursue. The case was declared cold and pushed into storage. A file closed in a cabinet. The Florence Times-Daily ran a headline that read, 13 months of investigation, no results. For the Monroe and Whitaker families, it felt like a second blow. As if their children had been erased, not only from life, but from the very system that should have fought for them. The community's trust in the investigation collapsed. Conversations around town turned darker. People whispered that maybe someone powerful was being protected. The idea that the truth was being buried on purpose spread through coffee shops, church pews, and late-night porches, yet Florence did not forget Jessica and Daniel. Every July 14th, hundreds gathered by the Tennessee River to light candles in their memory. The glow of those candles shimmered on the water like fragile hope. Parents clutched photos, friends sang songs, and Amanda stood at the center holding a poster that read, "Who took their youth?" With each vigil, the grief grew heavier. But so did the determination. And while the case file gathered dust, the fire of anger in the families and in the town refused to burn out completely. All it needed was one spark to bring the frozen silence back to life. As the case sat frozen, the weight of waiting began to crush the families who had already given everything. Daniel's father, once a strong man who believed deeply in fairness, carried his grief like a shadow that never left his side. He spent nights staring at his son's photo on the mantle, his eyes hollow, his health slowly fading. In May of 2010, while sitting in his living room, he collapsed from a sudden stroke. He was gone before anyone could call for help. His death left the Whitaker family broken, and it left Florence with the haunting knowledge that he had taken his pain to the grave, without ever knowing what happened to his son. Jessica's mother held on longer, but the pressure of being the face of tragedy in a small town was unbearable. Neighbors whispered in grocery stores, strangers asked questions she could not answer, and every street corner carried the memory of her missing daughter. By 2011, her strength gave way. She packed a few belongings and quietly moved to live with relatives in Birmingham. On the table, she left a handwritten note for her younger daughter, Amanda. "Keep going, sweetheart. I cannot do this anymore, but I believe in you." That note became a turning point. Amanda Monroe was only 24, but her eyes carried a determination forged in loss. She refused to let her sister fade into a forgotten file. With no formal training, she began teaching herself to read forensic documents, study state laws, and understand how police investigations worked. She wrote letters month after month demanding that the case be reopened. She created an online group called Justice for Jessica and Daniel, drawing in reporters, amateur investigators, and strangers who still remembered the night of July 14th. Amanda stood where her father's strength had broken, and where her mother's hope had crumbled. She became the lone torchbearer, carrying the fight forward when everyone else had been forced into silence. And with every post, every letter, and every sleepless night, she kept the names, Jessica Monroe and Daniel Whitaker, alive in the heart of Florence. But even Amanda could not have expected the anonymous message that would arrive and point her straight back to the clue the town had tried to erase. Amanda had been carrying the weight of the case almost entirely on her own when a message appeared that changed everything. It was September of 2012. A late evening, when she sat at her desk, surrounded by files, old photos, and the letters she had sent to the police. Her inbox lit up with a new email. There was no name attached, no signature, and no explanation. Only 4 words written in plain text. "Ask about the red Bronco." Her heart raced as she read it over and over. The Bronco. The same vehicle that a witness had once described. The same clue that had vanished from the official reports. For years she had asked why no one followed it further. Why it seemed to disappear from the investigation, as if it had never existed. Now, someone anonymous had put it back in front of her with a single chilling sentence. Amanda printed the email immediately. She placed it on her bulletin board beside photos of Jessica smiling with her Polaroid camera and Daniel standing beside his Silverado. She pinned it in the center as if it were the missing piece that connected every unanswered question. To her, this was no coincidence. It was a reminder that the truth had not vanished completely. Someone out there still knew. Someone wanted her to keep digging. That night, she stood in her quiet living room and whispered to her sister's photos, "I will not stop. I will not let this disappear." Her resolve hardened more than ever before. She understood that her father had taken his pain to the grave, and her mother had been forced to leave Florence to survive. But Amanda was still here, and she was ready to chase the shadow of the red Bronco wherever it led. What she did not know was that this single message would pull her into a cruel game. One where real clues and staged lies would blur until she could barely tell which was which. 3 years passed after that haunting email, and Amanda kept her search alive, chasing every detail of the Bronco that had slipped into silence. Then, on a sweltering June morning in 2015, her phone rang with a call that chilled her. The voice on the other end was rough and hurried. "The old warehouse off County Road 14. Go there." Before she could ask who it was, the line went dead. Amanda immediately pressed the police to check it out. At first they hesitated, worn down by what they called years of false leads. But she refused to let the moment slip. Reluctantly, 2 officers joined her at the warehouse. The building stood isolated in tall grass, its tin roof rusting, its wooden doors sagging on their hinges. When the door was pushed open, a thick smell of mold and dust filled the air. Inside, among the debris, something glinted faintly on the floor. It was a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant, engraved with a single letter. Amanda's breath caught. She knew that necklace. Jessica had worn it through high school, a piece she rarely took off. The sight of it nearly buckled her knees. The item was sealed and sent to the forensic lab. News traveled quickly and headlines declared new evidence discovered in Florence's disappearance. For a brief moment, Amanda felt light pierce through years of darkness. She allowed herself to believe she had finally uncovered a trace of her sister, but the hope collapsed as quickly as it rose. When the forensic report returned, the conclusion was devastating. The small traces of blood inside the pendant clasps were not human, they were pig blood. The DNA found on the necklace did not match Jessica or Daniel. Experts stated bluntly that the evidence had been staged. The police chief addressed the press with a dismissive tone, calling the necklace nothing more than a cruel prank. Social media erupted with harsh voices accusing Amanda of being obsessed and desperate. Some even mocked her, suggesting she had planted the necklace herself. Amanda sat alone that night, staring at the faded printout of the old email that told her to ask about the red Bronco. She knew she had not imagined this. She knew someone had deliberately led her to that warehouse and planted false evidence to destroy her credibility. Instead of silencing her, the attempt lit a deeper fire. She whispered into the quiet room that if someone was trying this hard to stop her, then she must be closer to the truth than ever before. What she could not imagine was how, for years later, the earth itself would give up a rusted box that carried the real traces of Jessica and Daniel. By the summer of 2019, Florence had grown used to living with silence. The case of Jessica and Daniel felt like a wound that would never close. Then, on a grey morning near the small town of Killen, a logger stumbled across something that would reignite everything. While clearing ground near an old oak tree, his shovel struck a heavy object beneath the soil. Pulling it free, he uncovered a rusted metal box. Its lock long broken and its surface caked in mud. Curiosity pushed him to pry it open. Inside lay items that froze him where he stood. A wristwatch with the initials DW engraved on its back. A torn concert ticket barely holding the date of July 14, 2007. And most haunting of all, a Polaroid photograph showing Jessica Monroe at the festival, her face caught in a candid moment of joy, her smile bright against the night sky. The angle of the photo made it clear it had been taken from a distance. From the eyes of someone watching her unseen. The discovery was rushed to police and sealed for forensic testing. News spread quickly, and within hours, Florence was buzzing with disbelief and uneasy hope. After 12 long years, physical proof connected to Jessica and Daniel had surfaced. When forensic results came back, they carried a name that had once been whispered and then buried. DNA and sweat traces on the surface of the metal box matched Caleb Johnson, a local mechanic now in his 30s. Caleb was not a stranger to Florence. He had once driven an old red Bronco, the very vehicle that a witness had claimed to see trailing Daniel's Silverado on the night of the disappearance. That Bronco had vanished from town not long after, leaving only rumors in its place. Revelation hit Florence like a thunderclap. Families who had begged for attention to the Bronco years earlier now demanded to know why Caleb's name had been ignored. For others, caution took hold. They feared this could be another staged piece. Like the necklace, a cruel twist meant to confuse, but the evidence was undeniable. With Caleb's DNA tied directly to the box that held Daniel's watch, Jessica's image, and the ticket from the night they vanished, the case was formally reopened. For Amanda, the moment was overwhelming. She had spent years mocked and doubted, but now the truth had risen out of the earth itself. She whispered to Jessica's photo on her wall that the path to justice had finally begun to clear. And as Florence erupted in debate, search teams prepared to comb new ground, hoping that the earth still held more secrets buried in shallow silence. After the rusted metal box forced the case open again, search teams turned their focus toward the wildlands around Muscle Shoals. Witnesses had long whispered of Caleb Johnson's Bronco being seen in those areas late at night. And now, the police were determined to comb every inch. A wide net of officers, FBI agents, and volunteers moved slowly across the dense woods. Their steps heavy with expectation. Cadaver dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the ground as they swept in careful formation. Hours passed with nothing but silence, and the creak of branches. Then one of the dogs suddenly barked sharply and began clawing at uneven ground beneath an old tree. The handler's face grew tense. Another dog joined in, growling and pulling hard at the soil. The area was immediately cordoned off and officers began to dig by hand, brushing away dry earth with care. Soon, fragments appeared, small ivory-colored shards, then the unmistakable curve of a shin bone. The digging grew slower, more deliberate. Within minutes, 2 partial skeletons began to surface from shallow graves less than a meter deep. One set lay just steps away from the other, the earth barely concealing what had been hidden for over a decade. Among the remains, objects were found that tore at the hearts of the families. Clinging to a rib bone was a silver star-shaped earring, dulled by soil, but still recognizable as the gift Jessica had worn proudly since her 17th birthday. Near the second set of remains, pressed against the pelvis, was a black leather wallet. Inside it sat a faded University of North Alabama student ID card. The name was clear: Daniel Whitaker. The remains were transferred to forensic labs, where the autopsy results confirmed what the families feared. Both Jessica and Daniel had suffered severe cranial trauma from repeated blows with a hard object, likely a metal pipe or club. There were no signs of restraints, no evidence of captivity. The attack had been swift, brutal, and deliberate. It was not an accident. It was targeted violence. The confirmation sent waves through Florence. After 12 years of uncertainty, the truth was now undeniable. Jessica and Daniel had not vanished into mystery. They had been struck down and buried in shallow earth, their final belongings left behind as silent witnesses. And as the news broke, all eyes turned back to Caleb Johnson, the man whose DNA now sat at the center of both the rusted box and the brutal graves. As Florence tried to absorb the shock of the remains being found, a retired officer stepped forward with words that cut even deeper than the discovery itself. Richard Hayes, who had worked on the original investigation in 2007, agreed to sit down with a local reporter. What he revealed made the town's blood run cold. Hayes explained that in the very first days after Jessica and Daniel vanished, Caleb Johnson's name was already present in the case notes. A witness had reported seeing him at the music festival that night, driving the distinctive red Bronco. Hayes himself had written a request to bring Caleb in for questioning, but that request never went through. Instead, the file carried a short remark: insufficient grounds to proceed. Caleb's name disappeared from the active investigation before he was ever questioned. Hayes leaned forward during the interview and admitted that there had been pressure from above. The case, he said, was pushed toward a narrative that made more sense on paper: romantic jealousy. The focus on Ethan Cole was not an accident. It was a convenient path that allowed investigators to claim they were making progress. While Caleb's Bronco quietly faded out of the reports, rumors began to swirl across Florence with new intensity. Caleb's father had once worked in transportation, a job that tied him to people in positions of influence. Nothing was confirmed, but whispers grew that the Bronco was not ignored because of a mistake. It was ignored because looking at Caleb too closely might have angered the wrong people. Amanda Monroe nearly collapsed when she heard Hayes's words. For 12 years, her family had been told there were no leads, no names, no real evidence. Yet Caleb's name had been there from the start. She stood before reporters with fury burning in her voice. For more than a decade, we begged for answers while his name sat in their files. They let us live in hell while the truth gathered dust. The revelation split Florence sharply. Some saw it as staggering incompetence. Others believed it was proof of something darker, a cover to protect one of their own. The community that had once whispered in half-truths now demanded answers out loud, and with the remains uncovered and Hayes's revelations echoing through the town, the families knew the moment had finally come when Caleb Johnson could no longer hide behind silence. On the morning of March 12, 2020, Florence woke to the sound of sirens and the sight of flashing lights on the outskirts of town. A convoy of patrol cars and a SWAT team surrounded the small wooden house where Caleb Johnson had lived quietly for years. Neighbors stepped onto porches in disbelief as a megaphone echoed through the air. "Caleb Johnson, we have a warrant for your arrest. Come out with your hands up." For 10 tense minutes, there was no movement. Then the door opened, and Caleb stepped out. His hair was unkempt, his shirt wrinkled, but his eyes were cold and steady. He raised his hands without protest, his face giving away nothing. After 13 years of silence, the man once tied to the red Bronco was finally in custody. Inside the interrogation room, Caleb spoke in a calm, measured voice. He denied everything. He said he knew nothing about Jessica and Daniel. He insisted that the red Bronco had been sold long before that night in July 2007. When investigators showed him the Polaroid of Jessica from the metal box, he smirked faintly and said that photo could belong to anyone. He treated the evidence like it was meaningless, as if the years of grief carried by two families did not touch him at all. His defense attorney, a seasoned local lawyer named Howard Lang, quickly stepped into the spotlight. Standing before cameras, he declared that his client had a clear alibi. On the night of July 14, 2007, Caleb had been with his girlfriend. She was ready to testify to that fact. Lang dismissed the forensic evidence as unreliable, suggesting the box could have been planted and the DNA contaminated. The statement shook Florence. For some, the claim of an alibi reopened doubts. Could this really be another trap of misleading clues? For others, it only deepened their anger. The families who had waited more than a decade knew in their hearts that no alibi could explain why Caleb's DNA sat on the watch, the box, and inside the Silverado itself. Amanda Monroe stood outside the courthouse with Jessica's photo in her hands. Her voice was steady but sharp. A fake alibi cannot erase blood. A fake alibi cannot erase the watch, or the camera, or the graves. She promised that this time the truth would not be allowed to slip away. And as the town held its breath, investigators began pressing harder on Caleb's girlfriend, the woman whose testimony would either shield him or shatter his story. When investigators turned to Melissa Carter, the woman Caleb's lawyer claimed could prove his alibi, the truth began to fracture. Melissa walked into the interview room pale, her hands shaking, her eyes avoiding every glance. At first, she tried to repeat the story she had carried for years, that she had been with Caleb on the night Jessica and Daniel vanished. But the weight of 13 years of silence was too heavy. Her voice cracked, and the truth poured out. Melissa admitted that Caleb had not been with her at all that night. Instead, he had come to her after the concert in a state of agitation. He warned her that if the police ever asked, she was to lie and say he had been with her. She confessed that she had lived in fear for over a decade. Trapped by the threat he had placed over her, investigators moved quickly. They obtained a court order to examine Melissa's old phone that had been stored away from another case years earlier. Inside the memory of the SIM card, they uncovered a text message sent in the early hours of July 15, 2007. The words chilled everyone who read them. "If you open your mouth, you will disappear like they did." The sender was Caleb Johnson. This single line shattered any remaining doubt about the alibi. The false story had not only been built on a lie, but on intimidation and fear. Melissa wept as she confirmed that Caleb had coerced her, her tears reflecting 13 years of guilt and silence. When the prosecutor revealed this evidence, Florence erupted. People gathered outside the courthouse, carrying signs that read, "Fake alibi equals real crime." The public that had once wavered between doubt and belief now saw the truth with clarity. Caleb had not only hidden behind lies, but had threatened a woman into protecting him. Prosecutor Samuel Price stepped before the cameras and declared firmly that Caleb Johnson's alibi was nothing more than a fabrication. He called it a wall of lies built to hide the weight of blood. The community's patience turned to rage. The man they had once passed on the street as a quiet mechanic now stood revealed as someone willing to destroy others to protect himself. And as the false alibi crumbled to pieces, Caleb Johnson could no longer rely on silence or manipulation. The path was opening toward a trial that would expose every hidden corner of the night Jessica and Daniel were taken. with the alibi destroyed and the town demanding justice. The case against Caleb Johnson moved toward the courtroom. Prosecutor Samuel Price, known across Alabama for his relentless pursuit in homicide trials, began to assemble every piece of evidence like links in a chain. On the table before him lay the rusted metal box unearthed beneath the oak in Killen. Inside it, Daniel's watch with the initials DW. The torn concert ticket that bore the date of July 14th. The Polaroid of Jessica, smiling under the festival lights. Taken by a camera Caleb had purchased only weeks before the disappearance. Alongside these sat the re-examined blood smear from Daniel's Silverado, confirmed through modern technology, to match Caleb's DNA. And finally, the remains recovered from shallow graves in Muscle Shoals. The fractures in their skulls told the same story. Repeated blows from a blunt object had ended their lives swiftly and deliberately. Price knew that science spoke with a voice louder than memory, and he prepared to let that voice guide the jury. But Caleb was not without defense. His lawyer, Howard Lang, crafted his strategy with sharp precision. He stood before television cameras arguing that the evidence was too old to be trusted. He claimed that a box buried in the woods could have been planted by anyone. He said DNA could be transferred accidentally, that bloodstains could have been mishandled in storage, and that bones lying underground for 12 years could not possibly tell a story strong enough to condemn a man. The clash of these two strategies set the stage for a trial that would grip not only Florence, but all of Alabama. For the families, it was not just about proving Caleb guilty. It was about forcing the truth into the light after years of darkness, lies, and neglect. And as the courthouse prepared to open its doors, Amanda Monroe was told she would not only watch from the gallery but take the stand as a voice for the 13-year struggle her family had endured. On the morning of June 8, 2020, the Lauderdale County Courthouse stood brimming with tension. Reporters lined the stone steps, cameras flashing as the doors opened to the trial Florence had waited 13 long years to see. Inside, every bench was filled. Families, neighbors, and strangers who had followed the case pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces heavy with expectation. When Caleb Johnson entered, the room fell into silence. Dressed in a pale gray shirt, his hair trimmed, his face gaunt from months in custody, he walked calmly to the defendant's chair. His eyes were cold, his arms folded as if he were there to observe rather than to defend. He looked out over the crowd with no trace of remorse, no hint of fear. Prosecutor Samuel Price rose to speak. His voice echoed firmly through the chamber. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are not here only to try a man. We are here to confront 13 years of silence. For more than a decade, a family has asked where their children went. Tonight, we will answer that question." He turned and pointed toward Caleb. "The answer sits right there." The lights dimmed slightly as screens flickered to life. One by one, images filled the room. The rusted metal box dug from beneath the oak, the Polaroid of Jessica, her youthful smile frozen in time. Daniel's watch engraved with DW, the black wallet pulled from the soil, and finally, photographs of the remains, with Jessica's silver star earring still clinging faintly to the bone. Gasps filled the gallery. Jessica's mother broke down, burying her face into Amanda's shoulder. Daniel's parents clung together, their frail hands trembling. Even seasoned reporters wiped their eyes as the contrast between the vibrant young faces of Jessica and Daniel and the stark bones of their remains filled the screen. Caleb, however, sat unmoving. He did not flinch, did not lower his gaze. At one moment, a faint smirk curled across his lips, a gesture that only deepened the outrage of those watching. To the families, it felt like he was mocking their pain. The first day of testimony closed, with a silence that seemed to weigh on every corner of the courthouse. The evidence had been laid bare, the story of 13 years buried in dust now pulled into the light. And as the jury filed out with grave expressions, the town of Florence knew the trial was not just about justice, but about whether truth could withstand doubt after so many years. The second day of trial shifted from emotion to science. The packed courtroom waited, as the prosecution called Dr. Laura Mitchell, one of Alabama's most respected forensic experts. Small in stature, but steady in presence, she walked to the witness stand and began to explain the evidence in clear and deliberate words. She held up an enlarged copy of the Polaroid photograph of Jessica at the festival. The jury leaned closer, as she explained that this specific Polaroid camera had been traced back to a purchase in June 2007. Records from the store showed the buyer was Caleb Johnson. A murmur ran through the gallery. This was not coincidence. It tied him directly to the last captured image of Jessica, alive. Next, Dr. Mitchell revealed the findings from Daniel's wristwatch, engraved with the initials DW. From beneath the worn leather strap, a single hair had been recovered. DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Caleb. On the large screen, she displayed the data charts showing the profile. She looked at the jury and stated firmly that the chance of this being anyone else was less than 1 in a million. Finally, she addressed the blood smear found inside Daniel's Silverado, preserved for over a decade and re-examined with modern technology. It matched Caleb's genetic markers. The smear on the passenger seat was no longer just a faint stain. It was a fingerprint of blood that pointed straight to him. Prosecutor Samuel Price stepped forward, his voice strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, these are 3 separate pieces of evidence. A camera he bought, a watch carrying his hair, a truck seat stained with his blood. Alone, each is powerful. Together, they form a chain that cannot be broken. All 3 converge on one man. Caleb Johnson. The weight of the evidence pressed on the room like a storm cloud. The families clung to each other, tears slipping down their cheeks as they finally heard proof spoken not as rumor but as science. The jury sat stiff, pens scratching notes, their faces grave. Caleb sat still, but his eyes flickered for the first time. The calm mask he had worn since the trial began beginning to crack, and while the courtroom absorbed the force of scientific truth, the defense prepared to strike back by leaning on the frailty of human memory. The third day in court brought a shift that unsettled everyone watching. The prosecution called Raymond Harris, the truck driver who back in 2007 had reported seeing a red Bronco tailing Daniel's Silverado on the dark highway. Many expected his words to lock the final piece into place. But when Harris took the stand, his hands trembled as he spoke. He admitted that after 13 years, his memory was not clear. He said he remembered a vehicle, maybe a Bronco, maybe another SUV. He said he thought it was red, but he could not swear to it. His voice faltered as he apologized, saying the night was dark and details blurred in his mind. The courtroom rippled with murmurs. Defense attorney Howard Lang stood quickly, a faint smile on his face. He turned to the jury and reminded them that human memory was fragile. He painted a picture of a community that had spent over a decade building a story around fragments and rumors. He asked the jury if they could condemn a man to life on the shaky recollections of a witness who could no longer be sure what he saw. For a moment, doubt seemed to creep into the air. A few jurors shifted uncomfortably, pens pausing over their notebooks. The defense pressed the weakness, repeating that if memory could waver, then everything else could too. But prosecutor Samuel Price was ready. He rose firmly and faced the jury. He reminded them that memories may fade, but science does not. He pointed back to the 3 anchors that had been laid down. Caleb's blood in Daniel's truck, Caleb's hair on Daniel's watch, Caleb's camera capturing Jessica on her last night. And then he reminded them of Caleb's own words, the indirect confession where he admitted being there and said things had gone too far. The room steadied again. The defense had chipped at memory, but the prosecution drew the jury's focus back to the evidence that could not waver with time. Amanda Monroe sat in the gallery, her hands clenched tightly, knowing how easily doubt could unravel years of truth. Yet she also knew that Caleb's mask was beginning to crack, and she sensed that soon his silence would give way to words he could not take back. The 4th day of the trial began like the others, but then something no one expected happened. Caleb Johnson, who had sat cold and silent through days of testimony, suddenly asked to speak. The courtroom froze as he rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly, though his voice was steady. He admitted he had been at the festival that night. In July 2007, he admitted he followed Jessica and Daniel as they left, his red Bronco trailing their Silverado down the dark stretch of US 72. He said he only wanted to talk to Jessica. But anger boiled when Daniel confronted him. He described the fight, his words disjointed, saying Daniel came at him, and he fought back. In his rage, he struck Daniel again and again, until he fell. Caleb's eyes dropped as he continued. He said Jessica screamed and tried to run. He panicked, grabbed her, and in the chaos, struck her head hard. She collapsed, and for a moment he stood frozen, realizing both were motionless on the ground. His voice faltered, but he pressed on, admitting he loaded their bodies and drove toward the backwoods near Muscle Shoals where he buried them. In shallow earth, he admitted throwing Jessica's handbag into the river to mislead investigators. He admitted planting the fake necklace, years later, to confuse the trail. And he admitted forcing Melissa Carter to lie for him, sending her a threat in the early hours of July 15th to seal her silence. Gasps filled the gallery. Amanda sobbed into her hands as she listened to the words she had feared but always known. Caleb tried to frame his confession as a loss of control, insisting he never meant for it to happen. But prosecutor Samuel Price rose with fire in his voice. He told the jury that Caleb's own words proved intention, blocking the Silverado, striking Daniel repeatedly, silencing Jessica, burying their bodies, planting false evidence, and threatening witnesses. These were not the mistakes of a man who lost control. They were the calculated acts of someone determined to cover his crime. For the first time, Caleb lowered his gaze, the mask of icy defiance breaking. The courtroom sat in heavy silence, everyone realizing that after 13 years of whispers and unanswered questions, the killer had finally spoken aloud. And while his confession sent shockwaves through Florence, the prosecution knew they had to tie every act together to show it was not rage alone, but a deliberate chain of violence and deceit. The fifth day of the trial carried a weight unlike any other. Prosecutor Samuel Price walked to the center of the courtroom with a laser pointer in his hand and a timeline projected on the large screen behind him. He told the jury that now they would see the night of July 14, 2007. Not in scattered fragments, but in order, minute by minute. At 11:45 p.m., Jessica Monroe and Daniel Whitaker left the Tennessee River Music Festival. Witnesses recalled Daniel waving goodbye before driving away in his silver Silverado. Around midnight, Caleb Johnson's red Bronco was spotted leaving. In the same direction, at 12:30 a.m., Jessica's last message was sent to her friend. "Someone is following us." That message never arrived, but its echo was frozen in phone records forever. The screen showed a map with a red circle marking O'Neill Bridge, found inside the Silverado. This was not random. Price told the jury it showed planning. Caleb was not a man caught in a sudden fight. He was a man who marked a location and waited for his chance. At 12:40 a.m., the Silverado was blocked on the dark stretch of US 72. The confrontation erupted. Daniel stepped out to protect Jessica. Caleb struck him again and again with a blunt object until his skull fractured. Jessica screamed and tried to run. Caleb silenced her with brutal blows. The screen shifted to photos of the shallow graves near Muscle Shoals. Price described how Caleb transported both bodies, burying them less than a meter deep in the soil. Alongside the bones, the jury saw Daniel's faded student ID and Jessica's silver star earring, both recovered in 2019. Objects that carried the voices of the victims across more than a decade. Price explained how Caleb threw Jessica's handbag into the river to throw investigators off the trail, how years later, he planted the fake necklace to discredit Amanda and derail the search for truth. These were not the desperate moves of a panicked man. They were deliberate misdirections meant to bury the truth forever. The room sat in silence. As the timeline ended, the jury had just walked through the entire night, guided by testimony, evidence, and Caleb's own confession. And as the lights dimmed on the final slide, One question hung in the air. After seeing every detail laid out in sequence, could any juror truly believe Caleb Johnson was not guilty? When the timeline was complete, and every piece of evidence had been laid out, the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them, and Florence held its breath. Hours stretched into a day, and then into another. News crews camped on the courthouse steps. Families gathered outside holding candles and signs that read, "Justice for Jessica and Daniel." Every passing moment deepened the tension, as if 13 years of waiting had gathered into this single silence. On the third morning, the jury finally returned. The courtroom filled again, every eye fixed on the panel as they walked back to their seats. The judge asked Caleb Johnson to rise. He stood slowly, his face still locked in the same cold expression he had carried since the beginning. Amanda Monroe clutched her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Daniel's parents leaned on each other, frail but unyielding, waiting for the words they had feared and prayed for. The foreperson rose, holding the slip of paper that carried the weight of the community. The voice was steady but heavy as she read aloud, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Caleb Johnson, guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jessica Monroe and Daniel Whitaker." For a moment, the room was still, no sound, no movement. Then the gallery broke into sobs. Jessica's mother collapsed against Amanda's shoulder, tears streaming. Daniel's parents wept openly, finally hearing the words that ended years of torment. Amanda rose to her feet, her eyes locked on Caleb. Her tears fell freely, but her voice was steady as she whispered, "Finally, my sister is vindicated." Caleb did not flinch. He stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his eyes hard, as if the verdict meant nothing. His lawyer sank back into his chair, defeated, knowing that every attempt to cast doubt had shattered against the weight of science, testimony, and confession. The judge's gavel struck sharply, sealing the decision. Caleb Johnson was guilty. The gallery erupted in cries, prayers, and the sound of families embracing after a battle that had lasted more than a decade. And though the verdict had been delivered, one final question remained. What punishment would Caleb Johnson face for the lives he had taken and the years he had stolen? The day of sentencing arrived beneath the heavy summer heat of Florence. The courthouse steps were lined with residents carrying white flowers and candles, their faces solemn as they waited to hear the final words of justice. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than during the trial, but no less charged. Families filled the front rows, eyes fixed on the bench where the judge would speak the last lines of this long and painful chapter. Caleb Johnson was led into the courtroom in handcuffs. His gait was slow, his shoulders tense, his eyes staring forward without expression. He sat in the defendant's chair, but the cold confidence that once marked his presence seemed to have faded. The judge entered, and the room rose, then settled into silence. His voice was clear and deliberate as he read from the sentencing order. After consideration of the jury's verdict and the gravity of these crimes, the court sentences the defendant, Caleb Johnson, to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He will spend the remainder of his natural life in the custody of the Alabama Department of Corrections. The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder through the chamber. For a moment, the room was frozen. Then emotion broke free. Jessica's mother wept uncontrollably, clutching Amanda's arm. Daniel's parents held onto each other tightly, tears running down their lined faces. People in the gallery bowed their heads, some whispering prayers, others simply closing their eyes in relief. Amanda stood slowly, her hands wrapped around the framed photograph of Jessica in her graduation dress. Her voice shook with tears, but rang with strength. Justice came late, but it is here. Her words filled the courtroom, reaching every ear, carrying both sorrow and triumph. Caleb lowered his head, his once defiant stare gone. The guards moved forward, locking the cuffs around his wrists and leading him away. As he passed by the gallery, Amanda's eyes met his for a final time. Her gaze was steady, not of anger, but of finality. Caleb looked down again, the sound of the closing door marking the end of his presence in their lives. Outside, white balloons were released into the sky by the crowd. They drifted upward, carrying with them the memory of Jessica and Daniel. Symbols of peace after 13 years of darkness. And while the sentence had been delivered, Florence soon learned that the impact of this case would stretch far beyond the walls of a courtroom. In the weeks that followed the sentencing, Florence slowly began to breathe again, though the air still carried the weight of 13 lost years. The case spread far beyond Alabama, reaching national headlines. Newspapers across the country ran bold titles: "Alabama Cold Case Solved After 13 Years." Television screens replayed the image of Amanda Monroe clutching her sister's photograph, her tear-streaked face declaring that justice had finally come. For the people of Florence, the relief of a verdict was tangled with something darker. Many whispered in disbelief that they had lived side by side with the killer for over a decade. Some remembered bringing their cars to Caleb's garage. Others recalled drinking with him at bars, passing him at grocery stores, never suspecting the shadow he carried. The realization chilled them. The danger had not been far away. It had been within their streets all along. Experts called the case a triumph of forensic science. They explained how the preservation of evidence, even after years of neglect, had given investigators the tools to prove guilt. The smear of blood in Daniel's Silverado, the strand of hair in the watch, the DNA on the buried box. Each piece stood the test of time and told the truth when human memory faltered. But alongside the praise came questions that refused to fade. Why had Caleb's name and his red Bronco been overlooked in 2007? Why had a blood-stained hoodie disappeared from evidence? Why had the families been forced to carry their pain for so long while answers sat ignored? The community began to speak of negligence, of mistakes that had cost years of anguish. Some whispered of influence, of protection for the Johnson family in those early days. Trust in the authorities remained shaken even as the trial closed. Amanda Monroe, however, chose not to let bitterness become her only voice. She stepped into the public eye with strength, speaking at forums and gatherings about the importance of perseverance. She told the story of lighting candles by the river, of being mocked when she insisted on searching, of the anonymous messages that guided her, and of the moment she held her sister's photo in court as justice was delivered. She reminded communities everywhere that evidence must be preserved, that technology could uncover truths even after decades, but only if families and citizens refused to give up. Florence would never forget the night Jessica Monroe and Daniel Whitaker vanished, nor the 13 years that followed in silence and struggle. And as the Tennessee River flowed quietly past the town, people knew that this case had become more than a local tragedy. It had become a lesson, etched in memory, of how truth can be buried but never erased. And while justice had finally spoken, the story left behind a haunting reminder that silence and delay can be as heavy as the crime itself. The story of Jessica Monroe and Daniel Whitaker closes not only with a verdict, but with a message that carries far beyond Florence. For 13 long years, the truth was buried under silence, mistakes, and neglect. Yet it was science and the unyielding determination of Amanda Monroe that finally brought light into the darkness. DNA on a watch, blood in a truck, and a photograph that captured Jessica's last night were the voices that spoke when people failed to listen. Amanda's persistence turned grief into strength. She fought when others told her to stop. She carried the weight when her parents could not, and she proved that justice, though delayed, could still be found if you refuse to let go. Her fight is now remembered as one of the most powerful examples of what a single voice can achieve against years of silence. Every July 14th, Florence still gathers by the Tennessee River, but now, the candles that once burned as desperate prayers glow as symbols of remembrance. They honor Jessica's radiant smile and Daniel's gentle spirit. They remind the town that 2 young lives were stolen, but never erased. The vigil that was once a cry for justice has become a moment of closure, a way of saying that though they are gone, they will always live in memory. This case is more than a tragedy. It is proof that evidence, when preserved, can speak after decades. It is proof that families who refuse to give up can move mountains. And it is a reminder that truth can be delayed, but it can never be buried forever. If you are still here, watching this story, it means it touched you. And that means this story deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help us complete 5,000 likes, because this is the target my mother set for you, and together we can reach it. It is totally free, and it helps us keep telling stories like this. Tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this cold case story?